Great. Let me introduce our moderator for this session. I think she's probably known to all of you, Avesita Chichon, who heads the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation's Amazon Andes Initiative, which aims to secure the biodiversity and climatic function of the Amazon biome. And since the initiative began way back in 2001, it has helped to conserve and improve management of over 170 million hectares in the Amazon, which is nearly 1/3 of the original forest cover. And Avesita also led the team that developed the Foundation's forests and agricultural markets work, which I think, listening to Eduardo, is a clear natural development of things we need to deal with. Before coming to Moore, Avesita served as the executive director of the Latin American project at the Wildlife Conservation Society, where she led conservation programs in 15 countries. A long time ago, when Avesita was youth, she earned a PhD in anthropology from the University of Florida, and she just recently won their Distinguished Alum Award. So let me turn the moderation over to Avesita, and we'll see lessons learned from working with indigenous cultures in the Amazon together in partnership and collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosina, so much for this nice introduction. Buenas tardes, tengan todos ustedes. Boa tarde a todos. We've lost some people today, but it's not quantity, it's quality. So thank you. So today was a very inspiring day so far for me. We've listened about the youth, we've listened about the Arctic. Now we're going to talk about the Amazon. And this is a time really for reflection, I think for all of us too, given all the threats that we are experiencing, right? Fires in different places. In the Amazon, this is the month in August when fires begin because people start to cultivate in their plots. And so there's good and bad fires. The problem is that fires are getting out of proportion, and also deforestation is one of the main threats in the Amazon. So one of the things that I wanted to say is that we do know that the most important thing for the Amazon region is to avoid getting to the tipping point of ecological collapse. And we could get there if we do not protect, conserve, manage at least connected 70% of the forest. At the moment, 50% of the Amazon is under some sort of protection. And actually, half of that, at least half of that, is in the hands of indigenous peoples. So it is critical then to think about how to manage this big area, which is like the size of the continental United States. At the Moore Foundation, we have started a second phase of our work, and we are supporting projects in four approaches that are in a sense integrated. One of them is protecting indigenous peoples and local communities' lands. And another one is maintaining freshwater and forest connectivity in large landscapes. A third one is mitigating the impact of infrastructure and other extractive economies that are threats to the integrity of the Amazon. And the fourth one has to do with institutional strengthening, because we do know that at the end of the day, it is people, it is institutions that are implementing all the work in the Amazon. So here today in this panel, we have four amazing representatives and one advisor, translator at the other corner, who himself is an amazing professional, but that's... So I'm going to say 5 great examples of professionals here that have worked and are working in the Amazon for a long time. I will be introducing one by one. And first I'm going to start with Valerie Hickey. She is a Global Director for Environment and Natural Resources and Blue Economy at the World Bank. Prior to that, she was a manager for advisory and operations in the Climate Change Group, where she oversaw the implementation of the World Bank's commitments on climate change, climate mainstreaming, and climate finance. 19 years ago, Valerie joined the World Bank as a specialist in East Asia and the Pacific, working on environment and rural development projects in Cambodia, China, and Laos. Now she oversees the Amazon Landscapes Program, in a sense. So we're going to hear a little bit about that, I suppose, too? Yes, and I also want to, well, she has a long CV, so I'm not going to say everything about this. I'm just going to point out that before joining the World Bank, Valerie worked for the World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, and the U.S. National Park Service. And she holds a PhD in environmental science and policy from Duke University. Thank you, Valerie. Please.
Thank you so very much, Ave. And of the 5 people sitting on this stage, I'm the least important one, so I'm going to make my remarks the fastest. And I want to start by just sort of providing 3 points of context for what I'm going to say. The first thing is this is a conversation about how to include Indigenous and local voices in conversations about the Amazon. I'm obviously not from the Amazon. I'm Irish. And so I'm not the right person to be sitting at this stage talking about this. I've had the enormous privilege of visiting the Amazon, of getting to work with incredible professionals, including everybody on this panel, many of the people in the audience, thousands more who work every day to try and integrate development, climate, and nature in the Amazon. But I recognize that I'm a tourist. And so I just wanted to put that out there as sort of context. The second piece of context that I want to put out there, and I think it's important for this discussion, is how much in many ways at the World Bank, we regret that the conversation around conservation, including in the Amazon, has begun to narrow around a conversation that just speaks to the conservation pillar of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We don't spend enough time talking about sustainable use. We certainly don't spend enough time talking about benefit sharing. Having been lucky enough to participate in the fantastic CBD COP in Montreal last December, it dismayed me sometimes that the shorthand for the discussions at the COP was 30 by 30, so protected areas. And that doesn't speak enough to the interests of people who are the protectors of those protected areas, particularly in places like the Amazon, because the only reason the Amazon still stands is because of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and yet their voices are not there. So that's something we need to think about and be careful about speaking. And the third piece is how much, as we sit here in the GEF Assembly in 2023, as we have discussions around the Amazon, all of the easy things have been done. All of the decisions going forward entail trade-offs. And these are very real trade-offs that have very real implications for people. This morning I was lucky enough to join a panel on human-wildlife conflict. And this is something that's growing. It's the ugly downside of conservation success. In many parts of the world, because of conservation investments, because of the excellent work of local communities and Indigenous peoples, there is more wildlife. There are more interactions between humans and wildlife. For many of us here, those interactions are the source of inspiration. It's we get to see an animal in the wild, and that's what made us conservationists to begin with. But if your interaction is that you're just lost your entire crop to an elephant in a place like Bhutan, where 1/3 of all crops, and these are subsistence crops, are destroyed by elephants every year, that's not exactly going to inspire you to be a conservationist. There's real human-wildlife conflict as one of the trade-offs that we have to think about, including in the Amazon. The other trade-off, the much more dangerous one, and the one we don't talk about enough, is the human-human conflict in conservation. More than 3 people a week, mostly people from communities, mostly people from Indigenous communities, are murdered trying to defend the environment. That's a trade-off people are making, and that's a discussion we need to have more of, and that's happening in the Amazon today. And so those are three things that I just wanted to sort of put out there as context. I'm lucky enough at the World Bank with GEF funding, with partners, including the Moore Foundation, UNDP, UNEP, WWF, everybody, we manage something called the Amazon Sustainable Landscapes Program in 7 countries in the Amazon Basin. And together we've mobilized hundreds of millions of dollars to try and deliver development, conservation, and climate wins. And we've learned 2 big things as we've done this, together with partners. And we've been engaged, we've been lucky enough to be engaged in the Amazon for the last 30 years. So the 2 things we see as key to success is making sure that Indigenous and local voices are heard, and Indigenous and local interests are respected. When it comes to voice, it's really nice that at these international events, we invite Indigenous peoples, we invite members of local communities. But I worry sometimes that there's a little bit of theater with it. We're not actually serious about listening to what they're saying, but it's nice to have them on the dice. It's nice to have them in the room. And it's important that we do that, and we do that more, but it's also even more important that they have a seat at the table in national planning processes and national decision support processes. Because when Indigenous peoples and local communities are not at the table when decisions are made, their interests are on the menu, and their interests are the ones that are given up. So we have to find a way to increase the voice of Indigenous peoples and local communities, not in terms of theater, not just in international conventions, but in national and local decision-making bodies. The second thing we've really learned is that the interests, the real material interests of Indigenous peoples and local communities matter in the Amazon. And there is not a one-size-fits-all. You know, we have this great acronym, IPLCs, Indigenous People, Local Community, and we put it everywhere in our documents. Do this with IPLCs, do this for IPLCs, as if they are one group of people, all with the same interest. But the Amazon is home to 47 million people, 2.2 million of them Indigenous, comprising 400 groups in over 5,000 territories. Can we really pretend they're all going to have the same interests? Of course not. But one thing I do know that's the same is that of those 47 million people, and particularly the 2.2 million Indigenous peoples, on average, they are more poor than their national counterparts. Globally, 6% of the global population is Indigenous, and yet they make up 20% of the extreme poor, of people who have to live on less than $2.15 a day. So these are some of the most vulnerable people in the world living side by side with the richest natural capital. That's an irony we have to figure out. That's a tension we have to parse, and we can't do it by pretending they all have the same interests. And let me just finish, Ave, if I may, by just talking about, after all, we're the World Bank, so people want to hear about money and finance. And so one of the ways we want to make sure that the voice of Indigenous peoples and local communities are on the table, and that they have a seat at the table, and that they can use that seat at the table, is to make sure they have access to money. Because like it or not, money allows people to do things. It allows them to buy in the expertise they need. It allows them to do simple things like travel to a meeting that otherwise they can't afford to do. So we need to make sure more, particularly Indigenous communities, have access to all the money that's spent on the Amazon. In the last couple of years, less than 1% of the hundreds of millions of dollars, the billions of dollars spent on conservation and climate change in the Amazon have gone directly to Indigenous peoples. That's not enough. But often it's not that donors aren't willing to give that money to Indigenous peoples, it's that Indigenous peoples are missing 2 things. One, they're missing access to information to understand that this money is available. And that's something that at the World Bank we take very seriously, that we need to make sure this information is transparent, and we need to make sure that applications for finance, whether it's from us, whether it's from our partners, are accessible aren't written in conference jargon that those of us who've been in this business for 20, 30 years, half the time we don't know what they're asking for, not to mind Indigenous communities. But the most important thing we need to do, and something we're taking increasingly serious at the World Bank, is how do we provide the administrative and organizational capacity to Indigenous and local community groups so that they can actually compete for finance? Because they have the technical knowledge. We know that. They've been protecting the Amazon. They know the technical work. That capacity they have better than we do. What they don't always have is the financial management capacity. What they don't always have is the reporting capacity. That's the capacity we have to build so that they can stand up and access the finance themselves and be their own stewards of that finance, that they can self-determine for themselves based on their own voice and their own needs, different as they are among those 400 groups in the Amazon, what they need and what they want. So count on us as partners in the Amazon, but we do recognize most of us are tourists there, and we are here to support the Indigenous and local communities as you chart your path towards making conservation and climate change and development work for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Certainly, it is important to recognize the voices, as important to make sure that there is decision-making and power associated with that. Now let me turn to introduce you to Mariana Varese. Mariana is the director of the Amazon Landscapes and the Citizen Science for the Amazon Project at the Wildlife Conservation Society. She's also chief of party of a USAID-funded Together for Conservation project. And she's the coordination lead of the Citizen Science for the Amazon Network. She's a natural resource economist with over 25 years of conservation experience in the Amazon. And she holds a master's degree in Latin American Studies from, guess where? University of Florida. Mariana is very effective in convening and articulating multiple partners and perspectives. So thank you for that, Mariana. And she has been able to translate all of this into an impactful program design and implementation that is working from local to regional scales. So one more thing about Mariana is that she's the lead author of Chapter 33 in the Science Panel for the Amazon report, which is precisely on the topic of diverse knowledge. So thank you, Mariana. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Avesita. That chapter, it's a bit of a compilation of different experiences in the Amazon about collaborative knowledge generation, sharing, and put in practice. And it informs a bit of my presentation today. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. So I will share some lessons and provoke some discussion, although the whole day has been very provocative, on the need, the opportunities, and the challenges for collaborative learning. I like to call it collaborative learning because it puts us all in the same level. We are all learning. And, but it's also called collaborative knowledge generation, collaborative research. And the ultimate goal is to save the Amazon. So I chose the picture in this slide to, so I will tell, pásame el, oh, sorry. I was like,
¿Esto?
Oh, sí. I chose the picture in this slide because it's, it's called the Meeting of the Waters. It's near Manaus, where the Amazon River, which is a whitewater river, to the left, meets the Rio Negro, a blackwater river, to the right. And these rivers are born in headwaters far away from each other, and they, at their confluence, they start to run together, but in parallel. There are some pockets where they mix and link to each other. And then after more than 100 kilometers, they get mixed and create a new thing. And for me, this was a great image for the image of the diverse knowledge systems that are at play in the Amazon and how they interact. Indigenous knowledge, traditional and local knowledge, mainstream Western science, contextual and experiential knowledge, place-based knowledge, etc. And a wide range of cases and possibilities exist for these interactions. They can never touch each other. They can mix, integrate, and create a new thing. They can collaborate in certain moments or aspects and then go back their own ways. And power relations are critical and at play in this range of possibilities. Who has the last word? Historically, Western mainstream scientists and policymakers have had the power to establish the terms of this relationship between different knowledges. What is to be studied, who participates and how they participate, who gets credit for what is the purpose of the research, and how the results will be used. This unequal power relationship has been contested for a long time, and many innovative arrangements for more horizontal collaborative research have shown that just, equitable, and effective collaborative learning is possible. And Eduardo just mentioned several of these examples earlier today. And so we have multiple success stories and a strong foundation in the Amazon to build from that. And we also have multiple failure and many lessons to learn that should inform our way forward. I will tell the story of my work, and I guess I'm here because of this experience of the Amazon Waters and Citizen Science for the Amazon projects and now Alliance that goes around fish. But why fish? Because fish represent or are sentinels of the connectivity of the Amazon on an ecological, from an ecological perspective. But fish are also very important to people. And they're migratory giant catfish, migrate, are born like little eggs in the Andes foothill. They float and swim down to the Atlantic where they grow, and then they come back to the Andean foothills and the Western Amazon to spawn again. So they are critical for the connectivity of the entire basin. Everybody and their neighbor in the Amazon knows the rivers, knows about fish, eat fish, enjoy fish. So it really makes sense as a common thread to engage and mobilize people to work together. Okay, sorry. One of the important aspects of migratory fish, as I mentioned, is that they occupy different areas in the Amazon. But also in the Amazon, it's very common that fisheries or people that fish do it in many different ways. Towards the east, towards the Atlantic, tends to be more larger scale, more industrial. Towards the Western Amazon is more family-based. Even if a lot of the fish is commercialized, the activity is family-based. So how can we think about managing and conserving a species, and several species actually, but in such a diverse context? How can we do that? And the idea is that we'll work by connecting. That's how we thought about it. We will connect local community-based initiatives for sustainable fisheries across the Amazon basin, and with a multiscalar approach. So community-based management linked to subnational, national, and hopefully continental or multilateral management mechanisms. And to do that, when I say we, it's a network right now of over 25 organizations, from universities to local NGOs to grassroots organizations. So we took a long time to design and think about a common question, and then common protocols, agreements on how to use the information, how to access it, how to credit the contributions, etc. So after several days of testing, prototyping, and deploying, right now we have over 100,000 data points, and thanks to the involvement of almost 700 citizen scientists. And these are not individual people, sometimes they are fishers associations that join as one user, we call it. I wanted to take a little bit of time to credit or think about what is this alliance that made it possible to work at this scale in a connected way, and to have this important progress in relatively few years. This wouldn't have been possible without the generous contribution, well, of money from initially the Moore Foundation. They created, the Gordon Abbey Moore Foundation challenged us and helped us experiment, take the risk. And if it doesn't work, if it doesn't work, what happens? Well, you learn. So that really made a difference. It was a luxury. And this is something that shouldn't be a luxury. We need to have the opportunity of experimenting and of learning together. And this was also possible because of the generosity of the partners that trusted and also took the risks on their reputations, their time, sharing their knowledge and taking the risk together. So this collaboration at scale was possible also because the way we agreed to work was such that local goals for fisheries management, like communities wanted to manage their fish in their lakes, or fishers association wanted fishing permits, or a larger fishing cooperative needed the records to get access to off-season insurance. They could work for their own goals, but at the same time, they could contribute to an understanding at a larger scale of the migratory fish and migratory fisheries. So I think we have proven that this is possible to do. The next step is to getting into informing policies, informing decisions at multiple scales. I think our partners are already successful in doing it locally and subnationally, and we're trying nationally, but the next big step is to do it at multilateral scales. GEF is supporting actually a project in the Putumayo Basin in northwestern Amazon, where we will try to put all these lessons and dive into informing policy and decision-making towards the integrated management of this whole Putumayo-Isa basin. Wish us luck. From all this experience, I wanted to highlight a few lessons and principles, and I will only get now into the general stuff. I really love the practicalities because I'm a manager. In these details is where things really happen. So if there's time in the questions, I really want that we start discussing these as concrete recommendations for GEF and other donors and other NGOs, because this is where's the detail. But before getting into the super details, it's important to understand what it has been already said many times, actually. A first basic condition is to guarantee that the rights, the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples and local communities are guaranteed are protected. This includes the rights to land, rights to self-determination, obviously rights to health, to life, etc. And I put in that slide protect to remind us all that has become an emergency. It's not just a nice idea that it should happen sometime in the Amazon. This is right on an emergency, and Valerie spoke to that already. The level of vulnerability to illegal economies and threats associated to drug dealing, to land grabbing, illegal gold mining, and other illegal activities in the region are really serious. And we are asking indigenous people and local communities to lead the way in conserving their lands where they are fighting for their lives, literally. So as a conservation community, I think we need to work harder on that and partner with those who are experts on that. We generally are not. The second main thing I wanted to say is that there is already a lot of very good experiences, of very good models that need to be supported and scaled up. I like to think more about connected so that they can have an impact at larger scales, that can create this critical mass to make a difference. And the third thing that I wanted to say is to the GEF and to us as conservation communities that are non-indigenous, we need to be willing to give up power and take the risk. Right now, the burden of proof is on the indigenous people and local communities. No, they cannot manage large grants. No, they are not, no, more is needed. They need to do more to prove they can do it. And this is not because we are petty, I guess. This is because we have built systems that are very strong on accountability and transparency, etc. And that's why I'm saying we need to take the risk. Otherwise, we will never turn these declarations into action. And indigenous people, local communities, and youth have made a very important progress in taking power, because power is, there's some saying that power is not given, it's taken. But I really hope we can make things easier for them to take power, more power. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. These are all very useful insights, and we can discuss them in a bit more. So now I want to turn to introduce to you Corinne Friesendorp. She directs the Andes Amazon program in the Keller Science Action Center at the Field Museum in Chicago. She's a field biologist with deep experience with the flora and vegetation of the remotest corners of the Western Amazon. She works closely with South American partners to bring science to bear on conservation and the quality of life of local people. She also has a very long CV, so I'm going to shorten it a little bit to give you more time to talk. But one thing I do want to say for sure is that well, besides her credentials she received a BA from Princeton University, PhD from Michigan State University. Her dissertation was on plant diversity in Costa Rica rainforest. And also, Corinne is an amazing leader for expeditions in the field. And it's so wonderful to see her in action and convening different kinds of peoples, researchers, local guides, and local knowledge into these reports that I hope you are able to see in the web of the Field Museum, right? How many reports now?
31.
31 expeditions to the Amazon. Thank you, Corinne. Please, go ahead.
Do you mind if I stand up here?
Please do.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you, Avesita. It's great to be on this panel with all of you. I am not indigenous. I have spent the last 32 years of my life working closely with indigenous people, local people, in constructing knowledge together. And I work in a team where that is our focus. How do we build knowledge? How do we build coalitions? How do we build common agendas? Ave asked me to talk about, and this is my first GEF. So everyone in this room knows more about this than I do, I think. Ave asked me to talk about how does local and indigenous knowledge contribute to Western science, and how does this help to deliver the GEF's mandate? And so I'm going to do my best, but that's a really vast topic, like as vast as the Amazon. I want to start with a maloca. This is a communal house, a spiritual house in the Amazon. There are hundreds, there are perhaps thousands of malocas scattered across the basin. And this one is in Colombia. It's along the Caquetá River. It is in a place called Bajo Aguas Negras, which is an indigenous reserve. And this is a Huitoto community or a Murui community, and they are part of the gente del centro, or the people at the center of the world. And malocas are places of conversation. They're places of collective thought. They're places of reflection. They're places where decisions are made. They're places where the territory is managed spiritually. So I wanted to start here because what you're looking at here is a group of indigenous scientists, a group of biologists, a group of geologists, who together with a group of social scientists pulled together knowledge to make arguments to decision makers so that they could protect that place in a way that made sense for the people that were living there. And that's the sort of work that I've been involved with. And so what sort of knowledge do we bring together? We study plants and animals, we study soils, we study waters, we characterize what's common, we identify what's rare, we try to figure out what's special about this place, and how does it fit in with the context of the rest of the basin? Is it similar to places that are already protected, already conserved? And our social team, at the same time, focuses on the people who live in and around this place. What's their governance? How do they organize themselves? What are their social assets? What do they do really well? What's their knowledge of this territory? What's their history? And what are their aspirations for the future? And we bring that knowledge together with the threats to the well-being of the people and the landscape. And that can be things like what's in these photographs: illegal logging, coca, drug trafficking, gold mining, but it can also be all the sort of social ills associated with that, the health threats, the threats to the fabric of those communities, sort of the social ills that come with those threats. And then we bring all of that information together, all of these threads together, and we create an integrated analysis of opportunities and recommendations. And so this is a synthesis. I remember there was a slide this morning about this is where the miracle happens. And this is the art of doing this work, is how do you weave together information? How do you bring together these results in a series of concrete recommendations for next steps for management? And that philosophy of bringing together different strands of knowledge for conservation action on the ground is what guides our work. And we've been focused on these undesignated lands, the lands that Ave was talking about. How are we going to avoid this tipping point? We're at 50%. We need to be at least 70%. We'd love to be at 80% of lands that are under some form of conservation in the Amazon. And so putting knowledge into action on the ground is our guide. We collect information as a team. We produce these integrated reports. We share those reports with everyone, from local people to decision makers. And we've done these sorts of surveys. We call them biological and rapid biological and social inventories. We've done that in 24 landscapes in the Amazon. We've actually done 31. There's 6 in Cuba, and there's 1 in China. I'm not going to talk about this today. So this has all been in the Western Amazon, and you can see those areas in maroon here. And they're placed in the context of the green areas, which are protected areas in the basin, and the beige areas, which are indigenous lands. So over more than 2 decades, we've worked with 30 different indigenous nations, some of them more than once on various occasions. We've also worked with other local communities, campesino communities, riverine communities, and we're increasingly working with religious communities. And I think this is a bigger discussion that needs to be had about how we're engaging with, I think Valerie pointed out, there are a whole bunch of actors in the Amazon, including urban dwellers in the Amazon. And so how are we engaging with all of those people? And so the information from these rapid biological and social inventories has been provided to decision makers, and it's helped governments in Ecuador, the government of Peru, the government of Bolivia, to declare 17 new conservation areas. And those are both protected areas and indigenous lands, and it's about 9.6 million hectares of new conservation lands. And so one of the things I was asked are, what are some of the key takeaways from this work? What do you need to do to work in a landscape with indigenous and local people and achieve conservation outcomes? And I hadn't really thought about it until I came here, and so these are my sort of first thoughts. But one thing that feels really important is to map out the stakeholders in these landscapes. Who else is working there? Who are the local, regional, and national actors? This way that you really want to be in a place where you're building new work, complementing existing efforts, and this keeps you from derailing work in progress. This builds stronger efforts, and this sounds super obvious, but I'm seeing a lot of new monies coming into the basin, and there, in a lot of cases, is no consideration for what has happened in those landscapes before you begin to work. And in some ways, this is also saying, know the history of these places, understand the dynamics that have happened here. It doesn't even have to just be what's going on right now, but if this is an area where the rubber boom hit really hard 100 years ago, you need to understand that the people who are living there are the descendants of the survivors of these really terrible things that happened. And so I would say, enter humbly, enter with a vision of learning from those who are in that landscape already, celebrate the work that's ongoing, and use that as an opportunity to build the work that you are doing. The second thing that I think is really important is to bring together multiple kinds of knowledge. Building knowledge is a really deliberate act. It's a really inclusive act. You have to be inclusive from the beginning. Who are you inviting? How do you make sure that everyone knows that they are there because they have something to offer and something to learn? How are you building knowledge in a constructed, sort of holistic way? And it's super important to do that from the very beginning. I think it's really critical to define a common goal. I'm not even showing my summaries. Sorry about that. Define a common goal. We usually start by understanding the local vision of the territory. And that can take a long time. That can take multiple visits, multiple conversations in the spaces that make sense for those communities. And then we want to see, how does the inventory support that vision? How can we bring together knowledge that will help us make arguments in support of that local vision? And then finally, you really have to start locally. You want to gather information locally. You want to understand local conditions. But to get action to happen, the local, regional, and national agendas have to align. And that takes substantial work, substantial conversation. You need to move from one of these scales to the other and back again You need to keep everyone focused on the top recommendations. And this is what makes sense also for decision makers. Decision makers want to make a decision that keeps their voters happy. They don't want to walk into social environmental conflicts. They want to walk into wins. And so this work of aligning these agendas is really important. So those are our main takeaways from working sort of in individual landscapes. These are usually landscapes anywhere from several hundreds of thousands of hectares to over 1.5 million hectares. But I want to share one takeaway from a place where we've begun thinking at a much larger scale, and this is the 12 million hectares of the Putumayo-Isa watershed. This is what Mariana was just talking about. This is a watershed shared by Brazil and Colombia and Ecuador and Peru. And how did we go from thinking about these individual areas to thinking about this whole watershed? So a jaguar. So we watched a jaguar, actually. Ana Rosita Sainz, for those of you who know her from the Instituto del Bien Común in Peru, was the person who took this picture, but our social inventory team watched a jaguar leave Peru and swim across the entire Putumayo River. We were at the time doing an inventory in Peru, and it just entered into Colombia. No passport, no sense, no DNI, no cédula, no nothing. And it was a moment for us to say, this river isn't something that keeps people apart. It may form the country boundaries for these places, but this is actually a connection. The Putumayo connects countries, it connects people. Wildlife doesn't see a problem here. And so what we did, we had to do something really different. We didn't want to do an inventory in 12 million hectares. What we really needed to do was bring people together. And so we brought folks together, and this is something that started with two other institutions, the Instituto del Bien Común and the Fundación para la Conservación y el Desarrollo Sostenible in Colombia, FCDS. And these three institutions quickly became a whole bunch of institutions with this dream of the Putumayo-Isa. We brought together government, NGOs, indigenous organizations. From the beginning, everyone was at the same table. What was amazing about this, one part that was amazing was having the big group discussions, having everyone be able to hear one another. But the other part that was amazing were these smaller discussions, where you could have people from Parques in Colombia talking with indigenous people in Peru. All the indigenous people from Peru and the Putumayo had never all gotten together. And so having these conversations, figuring out ways to build a shared agenda, that ended up being one of the most important takeaways for us. And bringing those people together and building a common agenda then fed into this regional project, the Putumayo-Isa. This was an amazing opportunity for us as a team to talk with folks at the World Bank, a place we never thought we'd spend time, or I never thought I would spend time. But I met these incredible people, Claudia Sobrevilla, and yeah, definitely. She's an amazing human being, and Ana Maria Gonzalez, people who said, this is incredible. We had an opportunity to talk to the country representatives from the 4 countries in the GEF. And this is when we felt like, gosh, all this time we spent building these common agendas, that's now feeding into this GEF project. And so now governments, who I will say all 4 governments have historically ignored the Putumayo-Isa. It's been the most remote outpost for all of them. Now we're really focused on the Putumayo-Isa, and they have a regional project where all 4 countries collaborate together. And so this, for me, when we think about the GEF mandate, I'm really curious how this is going to come back to the communities, because communities spent a lot of time building ideas for this project. And so I'd be curious to see, I think this is a really well-structured project, but how is that going to reach these folks that helped build it? And then finally, I want to close by saying something about indigenous and local knowledge. And the first thing is really obvious. These people live in the Amazon, so they know how to make a living here. And their knowledge, the way that I hear people talking about their knowledge, it's very much from a use, or these are our natural allies in conservation. I think we need to see them as the experts on what is well-being in the Amazon. How do you live in the Amazon? I've spent 32 years in the Amazon, and I could not make a living in the Amazon. I don't have that relational knowledge. I don't have that connection of to, these ecological calendars. What do I plant when? What do I harvest when? How do I prepare myself spiritually to be able to harvest and plant? What are the dances you do? What are the songs you sing? What are the times that you harvest the palms to make also the material culture, the yucca strainers, the hammocks, the baskets, and all of that related to all of the other patterns in the Amazon? When do the ant swarms emerge? When does an area flood? When are you the most exposed to evil and disease? All of those things come into this knowledge of how do you make a living in the basin. And so I think we really want to be framing and centering our work with Indigenous people and local communities as being about well-being. I don't actually think that Indigenous people need help managing lands, governing lands. They need help securing rights to those lands. I do think there are real well-being issues happening in the basin where they could use help from the GEF. And I think some of those issues are around wastewater management. Some of those issues are about pollution, mercury poisoning. And I think if we want to see a real commitment from the GEF in working with Indigenous people and local communities, I think it's around this issue of what are the ways that we can help secure your well-being that may not be in a conservation space, that may be in a health space, that may be in an education space, that may be in, as I said, a water management space. And so I would just open that up for discussion to see what are the ways that we really could best be engaging with Indigenous people and local knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Corinne. This is lots of things to think about. Thank you so much. Oh, I wanted to show the map of Madre de Dios to introduce the next speaker, if possible. Okay, can you show Madre de Dios?
Yeah.
Okay. So Madre de Dios is a department, a region in Peru, the least populated still. The least populated, with a diversity of indigenous groups, and because of something that Corinne said, the rubber boom, right? And I want to introduce you now to the new president of FENAMAD, Federación Nativa de Madre de Dios, the Madre de Dios Indigenous Federation. Alfredo Vargas, thank you so much for being here with us. He is Shipibo from the native community of San Jacinto in the district of Tambopata, Madre de Dios. He has held the position of president of his community on 3 occasions, during which he successfully managed the construction of the community hall, a dining facility for the community's students, road construction and maintenance, among other initiatives. And he is now the president of FENAMAD, that represents a number of indigenous peoples on Madre de Dios, defending the fundamental and collective rights of indigenous peoples and native communities, including the rights of isolated indigenous peoples and those in initial contact. And next to him is Daniel Rodriguez. Thank you, Daniel, for being with us as well. He is a technical advisor to FENAMAD, and now he is translating for Alfredo. So, Alfredo, please, could you tell us a little bit about FENAMAD and also your suggestions for the GEF now that you have been a few days already working with a section of the GEF on specific things on indigenous peoples. So, please, Alfredo, welcome. Bienvenido, Alfredo. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros.
Gracias. De verdad, para mí es un privilegio estar aquí sentado de muchas personalidades y la importancia que me escuchen. Madre Dios es muy lejos, ¿no? Muy lejos y también con mucha riqueza en flora y fauna. Madre Dios.
It is for me a privilege. Thank you all. It is a privilege for me to be here and to be heard. Madre Dios is a very far away place with a very important environmental significance.
Madre Dios es considerado como la capital de la biodiversidad del Perú. Y de verdad, la defensa de la Amazonía es muy importante para nosotros como pueblos indígenas que vivimos allá en los bosques.
Madre de Dios is considered the capital biodiversity of Peru, and for us, indigenous peoples, it's very important to protect the biodiversity.
Siempre hablamos de salvaguardas. Yo creo que los pueblos indígenas siempre han hecho salvaguardas.
We always we tend to talk about safeguards, and we always, as indigenous people, have been protecting the environment.
Ancestralmente, pues hemos siempre conocido esos espacios, hemos vivido con esos espacios, como decía en un ejemplo, sin fronteras, ¿no?
We've always lived in those spaces, in those territories, and without borders.
Y siempre los pueblos indígenas, decía la primera panelista, la que ha intervenido, que nosotros los pueblos indígenas no somos pobres.
The first panelist said that the indigenous peoples are not poor. We're not poor.
Un buen ejemplo que hizo, ¿no? Yo creo que dentro de los pueblos indígenas, en la Amazonía, ahí tenemos la ancestralidad de nuestros abuelos, de nuestros ancestros, y tenemos el mercado, tenemos la medicina, tenemos la farmacia.
We have the ancestral knowledge of our people, and we also have a number of resources, and we have our pharmacy in the forests and our means of living.
Con esto no queremos decir que no es importante la economía, es muy importante la economía porque tenemos educación, tenemos tema de salud también. Yo creo que la salud es muy importante con la ancestralidad, también con los científicos, con los doctores.
Having said that, we also emphasize that it's important. Economy is important for us because we also have necessities, especially in terms of health and education.
Un tema importante fue en el tiempo de COVID. Los pueblos indígenas, esos territorios fueron muy importantes en el tiempo de COVID, ¿no? Muy importante.
During the COVID pandemic, the territories and the resources and our knowledge was very important to face the pandemics.
En Perú, más fallecieron hermanos que no eran de comunidades. Hermanos que estaban en comunidades pues no fallecieron porque ahí está el remedio. En Perú el famoso matico fue.
COVID impacted more strongly non-indigenous population than indigenous populations because we had remedies in the forest and such as matico.
Por eso es importante, de verdad, esta reunión muy importante por la Amazonía. Yo creo que es tiempo de trabajar en unidad con los entes representativos, llegar al actor propio, que son los miembros de las comunidades, los actores propios que están en el campo dentro de la ancestralidad.
Because of this, working together, this is an important time to work together and working with and supporting the people who are in the territories, indigenous people who are in the territories.
que se llegue a los actores propios. Yo creo que hizo un buen ejemplo la primera panelista y dijo que es importante, ¿no? ¿Por qué traemos a los indígenas y nos sentamos en una mesa? ¿Tenemos la importancia? Hizo una pregunta. Yo creo que sí, en estos momentos, en la actualidad, tenemos que tener la importancia de trabajar por la Amazonía.
The first panelist talked about the participation of indigenous peoples in international spaces, and I think that it's very important that we participate in an effective way and to be heard.
Por eso nosotros tenemos, ¿no?, algunas prioridades, algunas ideas que hemos visto. Por ejemplo, acá, ¿no?, tienen que promover.
We made a list of, based on our experience, a list of recommendations and suggestions in this regard.
Se tiene que promover y defender nuestros derechos reconocidos ante el Convenio 169 y otros estándares internacionales.
A first point is that the collaborative work needs to promote and defend our rights as they are acknowledged in the ILO 169 ILO Convention and other international standards.
Se tiene que responder a necesidades reales de las comunidades. Eso es muy importante. Eso es muy importante. Es importante consultarnos también sobre los temas que son realmente nuestras prioridades.
It is important that the work responds to the real necessities of the communities, and it is important to, in this sense, to ask and have a dialogue with us regarding our own priorities.
Los trabajos se deben realizar mediante un diálogo intercultural. Eso es importante. Yo creo que la interculturalidad es muy importante. Es importante que realmente sean participativos también, ¿no?
It is important that the work is developed in a participatory way and also includes intercultural mechanisms of dialogue with us.
Se debe reconocer el valor de nuestros aportes y nuestra propiedad sobre los conocimientos tradicionales.
Also, it is very important that the value of our contribution is acknowledged, and also the property of our traditional knowledge.
Los trabajos con los pueblos indígenas deben respetar nuestras organizaciones representativas. Muchas veces van directamente a la comunidad. No hay respeto a los entes representativos, a los que representan.
The work should be done in articulation with the representative organizations of the indigenous peoples, because we see that many times the work is done directly with the communities, and there's no prior dialogue and involvement with the indigenous organizations that represent those communities.
Otro punto que es importante también, que los trabajos se orienten a cambios profundos, ¿no?, y tengan una orientación a largo plazo, porque muchas veces terminan y no hay una continuidad, ¿no? Entonces ahí se pierde todo eso.
Another key point is that the work that's going to be developed that points out to structural changes, and it has an orientation to produce long-term, a follow-up in the long term, not punctual or short-term interventions.
Sería importante también que los trabajos apoyen iniciativas o procesos que ya están en marcha, ¿no? Yo creo que siempre los pueblos indígenas están en ese andar y en esa línea.
Also, it is very important to build up on initiatives and processes that indigenous peoples and their organizations are already working on, not starting from zero. Right?
significar y adaptar los formatos a nuestras capacidades, menos burocracia. Eso también es importante. Yo creo que hay que facilitar también los trabajos.
Another point is that it is important that the formats and the procedures are simplified and adapted to the capacities of indigenous peoples and their organizations, and especially with less, and try to minimize bureaucracy as well.
Los trabajos deben incorporar no solo la voz de los hombres, sino también de las mujeres, los jóvenes y los sabios.
Also, it is very important that the work involves not only the voice of men, but also women, youth, and the elders.
Muchos los trabajos tienen que tener un enfoque territorial, considerar que muchos pueblos están divididos entre regiones y países, ¿no? Eso también es importante.
Another important point is that the work should have a territorial focus, considering that many indigenous peoples are divided by administrative and frontiers, right?
Esos son algunos puntos que hemos considerado, ¿no? Yo creo que son importantes porque eso va a tener mucha más fuerza. Yo creo que unificándonos podemos defender nuestra Amazonía y trabajando con los actores propios. Es tiempo de trabajar con los actores propios y poder valorar la ancestralidad, la vida. Defendamos siempre la vida y la Amazonía.
These are some of the points that we thought could be useful to work forward, to work together, and to defend the Amazon and life.
FENAMAT, 41 años, defiende la vida de los hermanos aislados que llamamos nosotros en la región de Madre de Dios. Es un trabajo titánico que venimos haciendo y vamos a continuar en esa línea para seguir defendiendo la vida de los hermanos aislados de la región de Madre de Dios, hablando de mi país, de mi departamento.
FENAMAT has been defending indigenous rights for 41 years, including the rights of the communities and other indigenous peoples who live in voluntary isolation, and we are going to continue doing that.
Muchas gracias.
Sí.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo. Muchas gracias, Alfredo. Todas las recomendaciones excelentes. I think this is the time to open up for questions from the floor. Are there any questions from anyone here? Please.
First, thank you all for sharing your knowledge and experiences. I'm really grateful to have the chance to learn from you. I wanted to ask if you could speak more to the idea of adapting formats and procedures to minimize bureaucracy in order to enable some of these local initiatives to access funds and to kind of reduce the sort of issues in application and that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Sí, esto sería importante, ¿no?, para nosotros porque facilitaría el trabajo, ¿no? Y los entes representativos pues tienen un trabajo macro y yo creo que con facilitar esto sería importante, ¿no? Yo creo que hay menos burocracia ahí porque el reglamento es de verdad un poco muy duro, a veces porque siempre dicen que los pueblos indígenas no están capacitados para de repente manejar grandes proyectos. yo creo que sí, yo creo que estamos en la capacidad de poder.
Okay. Oh, wait. Well, he mentioned that and they say sometimes that indigenous peoples are not prepared to do to manage large projects, but we definitely are. The only thing is that the procedure should be adapted to the capacity of our own institutions, right? And the load of work that we have to do, which is defending the rights of indigenous peoples, no?
Espero haber podido responder su pregunta.
Yes, thank you very much. So, yeah. I was going to ask for closing remarks, but if you want, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Apologies. I just wanted to sort of add three things, if I may, to Senor Vargas's answer. The first way we simplify is we use common language. Whether it's Spanish, whether it's English, whether it's Portuguese, that doesn't matter. But in all of these languages currently, if you look at a GEF application and you look at the 100+ pages of a GEF application, it's a completely different language. It's not English, it's not Spanish, it's not Portuguese. There are words in there that I don't understand. I'm a native English speaker, I don't understand them. We simply have to speak this language. We have to have what we call, the World Bank, the grandmother sniff test. If you can't write it in a way that your grandmother will understand it, then stop writing it. And I think we've gotten very bad in the environment community at creating our own language, that if you come to these conferences, if you don't, you're excluded from it. And that's a form of power.
Yeah.
And that's really bad. We have to fix that. The second thing we have to do, we have a fragmentation among environmental funds. There is lots of money available for the Amazon, but it's in lots of different pots. There's the GEF, within the GEF, there's the Adaptation Fund. Now we're going to have the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. There's the Green Climate Fund. There's World Bank money. There's more foundation money. There's all sorts of money. And for every single pot of money, you have to answer different questions in different ways with different language. We have to start converging what we're asking for, so that we're not wasting the time of community organizations, indigenous organizations who don't have the capacity. And I don't mean capacity in terms of smarts. I mean capacity in terms of time and bandwidth and enough people to be writing something different to all of these different agencies. So we have to converge our application forms to make access easier. And finally, we have to make sure that we don't pretend that asking more questions and having a longer proposal is a substitute for transparency and guardrails and accountability. They're not the same thing. We need to be better at understanding what are the key questions and what are the key due diligence we need to do, and only has to be done once to show that that indigenous organization or that community organization knows what they're doing. Asking them to fill out another 20 pages isn't necessarily the answer. We have to trust. Trust but verify in a way that is quick, that is easy, and is the same for all pots of money. Thanks, Abby.
Thank you, Valerie. That's very, very true. Need to have a more simplified way of accessing to all these different funds. Are there any other questions before we go to the closing remarks? You have a question. Okay, go ahead. Please.
Thank you, and it's very enlightening for me, developing country perspective, where conservation of natural resources like forests or waterways is very challenging. And from our perspective, I would say that political ecology, the nexus between political, social, and economic actors are very, very critical. So I'm very curious if anyone can respond, whether in case of Amazon project, how did you diffuse or on board the political ecology factor? Thank you.
one quick answer from me, and then I'll pass on to the real experts, is what many of these people on the DICE have been talking about, which is working through local communities. Because those local communities are there for generations. They're not just one political administration and one 4-year period. And so working long-term, thinking about building green, resilient, inclusive relationships with those communities so that you're not as dependent on the political administration, but also understanding the realism that as political administrations and political priorities change, so may priorities on the ground. But at the end of the day, what's important is that as outside agencies like the World Bank, as we respond to the needs and the interests of local communities, of indigenous communities, and we make sure we can feed those needs up to whatever political administration is in power.
I'll just say really quickly that it's important to shift your attention to a place where you do feel like you can gain traction. And so there have been moments in Peru, for example, where at the national level things weren't super favorable, but at the regional level there were opportunities that were quite different. So that, we see the same thing obviously in Brazil in the previous administration, where you could work at the state level, but at the federal level things were much more complicated. I think the one thing that as a political ecology that is really difficult to face right now is that during the pandemic, illegal actors have really become emboldened. People who historically were in the shadows are now out in the open and are controlling big parts of the Brazilian, Peruvian, Colombian, Bolivian, Ecuadorian Amazon. And so to say nothing of Venezuela and the Guyanas, and I mean, it's there. That is something that I think we really need to take on as a group, and we're seeing some exciting things come out of the Amazonian Summit, thinking about how do you join forces across frontiers, something that Alfredo is also talking about.
Thank you so much for this panel. I have a very quick question. I know we're kind of delayed, but I am curious about the issue of adaptation to climate change and how indigenous communities in the Amazon are thinking about it and are gearing up to adapt to potential impacts of climate change. And is there any room for traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge to play? And how can the agencies and the GEF can contribute to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really gorgeous work on how communities navigate, especially along the main stem of the Amazon in Brazil. There's just really gorgeous ecological calendars about what you do in times of flooding and in times of lower waters, but also with a consideration for El Nino years, the big drought years, the big wet years, and just in terms of what you plant in those years and how some of these ecological calendars have gotten knocked out of balance, but also how people are making decisions based on what they already know. And I think they're just, yeah, there's some incredible things that exist that I'm happy to pass along to you that I think exist like that. And then I think there are lots of other ways that people in their malocas, in their casas grandes, all those places are making decisions about what to do and how they're receiving information about what's going on and how they're also managing their territories from those spaces. And most of those things are not written down, but those are things that are being talked about. There's some other things that happen actually in the Putumayo where people make decisions of, they're Peruvians who have their farms or their community gardens on the Colombian side because those are the areas that don't flood. There are lots of, they're binational agreements in quotes. There are agreements across the frontier among communities to manage fisheries, to manage planting seasons, and those things are also being done in the context of ever-changing conditions. So I think a lot of that information exists. I don't think that it's compiled, organized. I think it's scattered.
Very quickly, there are very interesting experiences and success stories and effective models where, especially around integrated management of indigenous land, where remote sensing, drones, and other technologies are used to have access to information at larger scales and more rapidly, more immediately than otherwise would be possible in remote areas in the Amazon. So the combination of these technologies with the knowledge and management decisions and life plans of indigenous territories or communal lands can be very powerful in understanding, well, in registering, understanding, projecting, and reacting to what climate change is bringing to the Amazon, that is mostly super increased variability and greater intensity of events. And also, I think, in the Amazon, given how interconnected it is, there is also more room, although there are good progress already made, there is more room to invest in connecting these local efforts with a larger scale perspective. Like, and create, I don't know, early warning systems, create a conversation to prepare and plan ahead for these increased droughts, increased floods. What does it mean for managing fisheries, for flowering moments or times, seasons, the calendar? It's shifting the calendar. So we need to be continued revised. So I think there's room for great cooperation between indigenous and local knowledge, modern technology, and the collaboration at scale.
Thank you. So when you do your closing remarks, please be very, very brief, but I also want to invite, I understand that Yolanda Terán and Galina Angarova from the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group are here. And would you like to say a few words, please? Welcome,
Hello.
Galina.
Thank you. Should we stay here?
Yeah. Or would you like to come here, please?
Okay.
Come on, no, quédense nomás. No tenemos mucho tiempo. ¿Las dos van a hablar? Sí. Ok, por favor. Welcome, Yolanda.
Ali Chishi, Tucuyacunawan, Eñuca, Yolanda Terán Micapani, Ecuador, Mamayac Tamanta. I would like to begin my points by recognizing the indigenous ancestors from this land first, and then giving my thanks for the organizers of this event. The things that I have here, the points that I wanted to share with you, more or less, you already touched on it, so, but I would like to repeat those what are very important for us. For instance, to understand the cultural meaning of Mother Earth and all her beings. And then the secure tenure of lands, territories, waters, and resources, also for indigenous women and girls. We need to remember always that our knowledge is millennial, is holistic, is transmitted orally from one generation to the next. Is dynamic and is immersed in our epistemologies, cosmovisions, spirituality, and also is linked with a geographical space. I would like to quote Dr. Cajete, who says that there is a plant, an animal, a mountain, a river, a song that is related to a specific place. our knowledge is based in relationships between men and women and also with Mother Earth. And also, we must remember that our knowledge is learned by doing, by using our hands. And we need to keep alive this social tapestry for our children of this generation and also for the generations that are coming behind us. And of course, all of this should be in line with human rights, self-determination, cultural sovereignty, UNRIP, and the national and international legal instruments and safeguards. Also, it's important to remember that our knowledge is based in the cycle of life, cycle of agriculture, the calendars, and so on. And we have principles, we have values, we have mandates. All of these things to get the summa causa, the collective well-being. And of course, our knowledge is linked to the languages. And we need to understand, for instance, the concept of garden. When we say garden, we are speaking about seeds, about soil, about plants, about water, ceremonies, chants, the work of men and women together, and also the practice of values like being in solidarity and reciprocity and so on. Always we like to evaluate our knowledge to see if it is working for the benefits of our people. Well, I have many points, but I would like to say that our knowledge is, the pillars for our knowledge are the elders and the women. It's important for us as indigenous peoples to work every day in order to find our face, our heart, our identity and place. And also, it's so important to remember as indigenous peoples who we are, where we are now, and where we want to go. And concerning to sciences, Western sciences, I would like to invite the staff to work with the IPAC. We have wise people, we have indigenous members there, we have a lot of knowledge and also the goodwill to work in a framework of respect, understanding, and trust. That is the main thing. And we are speaking about the new global framework, so there are goals, there are targets. Specifically, as a woman, as indigenous woman, I think that the targets 3, 8, 13, 19, 20, 21, 22 are very important. We need to see how to put together the indigenous knowledge with the Western knowledge. We need to close the gaps that we have as indigenous peoples. And we need to think how we are going to make the technological transfer to indigenous peoples. How is going to be done the capacity building in a cultural appropriate way. And so always we are speaking about getting a transformation. I would like to invite all of us to join our shoulders, to join our hands and work together. We need really to go hand in hand because we are the siblings of Mother Earth. And as such, we need to be working together. And so, yeah, I would like to stop there. And please forgive me if it took so many minutes, but it's important for me to share with you the basis for our knowledge, what is important for us. Thank you very much, Yupaichani.
Thank you.
Sembena Hundutun Hudud, Minin Nirgalingje, Angarva. This is a greeting in my native language. I am originally from Siberia. I think most underrepresented constituency in these gatherings, difficult political situation and all. Just what I wanted to say is that traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples is not a hypothetical thing. It's not a hypothetical notion. For a lot of us indigenous peoples, it's a matter of life and death. If you go to the Arctic, if you don't know the ice, if you don't know the snow, it can become a matter of life and death. The same with many communities living within very close proximity with wildlife. It's the sight, it's the smell, it's the wind, everything that people can read and understand whether it's safe and whether it's not safe for them. I can give many examples. Let me give you an example from my native language. We don't have a word for environment. We have a word for a state of being. This word is betel, but the state of being of self and everything around you. We don't have that duality. Everything that happens outside of you is actually happening to you. So therefore, that informs, because we don't have that that construct that something outside is not exactly inside. So we don't have that construct. It will impact your action. It will inform how you communicate and interact with everything around you. In Salish territories, the word for tree is the one that holds the earth. Imagine, if you know that this is the one that holds the earth, how are you going to treat that one? You're going to treat that one as your relative. There's so many ways, so many things. Examples, pharmaceuticals. How did that industry develop? A lot of it came from traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. The compounds that were found in the plants that indigenous peoples have co-managed for millennia have become those building blocks for the pills that are being sold for so much money and we're dependent on. But the problem is that indigenous peoples are not being compensated for that traditional knowledge. So I think that one of the ways we would like to contribute as IPAC is informing staff, informing GEF in general about the role of traditional knowledge and how we can work together. We have frameworks. Indigenous peoples have frameworks. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 31. We have AJ, of course, at CBD. We have Article 4 of the ILO Convention 169. These are our frameworks. But we also want to work together in order to address the challenges because the appropriation is there, the not communicating or consulting or seeking free, prior, informed consent of indigenous peoples are there. And let's work together to address those issues. Fair compensation, impact benefit agreements with indigenous peoples, working together towards common goals, and recognizing that indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge is a communal, collective body of knowledge that you need to consult with communities, not just individuals, and also recognizing that traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples is oral tradition. You cannot just put everything that is being said by indigenous peoples in the papers without referencing what's being said. So that's kind of my final words. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those interventions, and also want to thank the Pachamama for the diversity of cultures, diversity of opinions, and how we can all come together and understand the world better. No one holds the truth by oneself. No one culture holds the truth either. So it is important to have diversity in every way. So thank you to Pachamama for that, to Mother Earth. Yes. Okay, so final remarks. Maybe we should start on the other side. So please, Alfredo, can you start with your very short final remarks? 3 palabras.
3 palabras. Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias. De verdad, para mí ha sido un honor ser parte de este panel, muy importante, ¿no? Y de verdad yo creo que esto para mí me fortalece mucho más como representante de los pueblos indígenas, de la Amazonía peruana. Y de verdad el mensaje sería unidad y trabajar en coordinación entre todos los actores del bosque, las comunidades, los actores principales. Así se va a poder avanzar. Yo creo que es importante involucrar, ¿no? Y ver el mensaje es unidad. Gracias.
It's been very important for me to be in this panel. I'm very grateful for that. It really strengthens me as an indigenous leader. And if I was to summarize with one word, the importance of this meeting is unity. It's only through unity we could move forward and produce meaningful changes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm super curious to see what's going to happen over the next few years. I'm curious how this is going to play out and how Indigenous people, local communities are going to be closer to these governmental efforts funded by the Global Environmental Facility. And I'm really curious to see what the CEO of the GEF was talking about today, how civil society is going to be engaged in these efforts and what that's going to look like. I think that's going to be really important. In our experience, the work we've done with the Amazon Sustainable Landscapes Program at the World Bank has just been really exciting because it's been about building coalitions, building information together, working together across governments, NGOs, Indigenous people, local communities. And I think the more we can build those sorts of efforts, so sort of echoing this idea of unity, I think that's going to be really exciting to see what that looks like over the next few years. Thanks.
Working together, collaborating, is not spontaneous. It's not easy. Really doing it meaningfully, it's hard. It takes you out of your comfort zone. It forces you to recognize that you don't know many things. It forces you to be humble and to be willing to learn and to willing to accept decisions or ideas that you might not agree with them. But it's about giving up power. It needs to be nurtured. And a lot of investment needs to happen to make it happen and make it last. So, and as a manager, I also think that it will be very important in the next, hopefully in the next days, but in the next months, to really sit together and figure out the details, the specific ways that GEF and its partners, we all can figure out the ways for a more collaborative relationship between Western science and indigenous and traditional knowledges for a horizontal and constructive conversation for conserving nature for the well-being of our people. It's a lot of work. It's managing a lot of tensions, but it needs to be done. That's my thinking. Good luck.
The only job of the World Bank, whether it's through the Amazon Sustainable Landscapes Program or all of our investments in the Amazon, is to make available our money, our convening services, and our technical assistance to the indigenous peoples and the local communities of the Amazon so that they can determine their future. They can define their needs. They can deliver those needs in a way that is important to them and in a way that is meaningful to them. That's it. Punto.
Thank you so much. Thanks for this wonderful panel. Rosina, please. Gracias, chicas.
Well, it's really hard to follow you all. I was going to try to do a summary of the whole day, but I think that would be difficult and exhausting. So let me just say a few things from where we started and where I think we ended up. You know, we did hear there was so much wit and wisdom and deep understanding in these speakers, and many themes came up, sometimes with different words, but over and over again. So, you know, as several of you noted, Carlos Manuel started by telling us that as CEO, he is absolutely committed to the goals of this assembly, which include elevating women, youth, indigenous people, and local communities. And then in the subsequent conversations in the morning, we started to lay out some of the needed tools to make this happen that can amplify these voices, and they ranged from talking about behavior change and social science and policy coherence and appropriate engagement and respect, knowledge management, partnerships, integration, innovation, all with the vision that you mentioned of getting to transformational change. The youth panel, for those of you who were not here, they were appropriately angry and impatient. But some of the themes that came out of them came also from the later panels too. They made a point of saying, you know, conversation is as much about listening as talking. And I think we heard that come up again and again this afternoon too. And I think at least in all of these, we have been trying to both listen and talk. But they began also telling about the role of storytelling, which came up again and again, about forming communities, about educating and making knowledge usable, making knowledge accessible in ways that they can find. And in the case of youth, I think that means, Eduardo, you're going on TikTok because they might not find your talk otherwise. But they also mentioned that apathy was the thing that we should worry the most about, and I think that was also a theme that came up. You know, you taught us many things. You gave us examples of things that made projects successful, Eduardo, you know, using local knowledge, having common visions, motivations, co-production of knowledge, a term that came up quite a bit too, and ways to do things wrong or unintended consequences, talking about urban networks, commodity extraction, et cetera. The conflict that we will feel between appropriation and wanting to take stuff and provisioning and wanting to keep stuff that permeated a lot of the talks all day. How expensive it is to monitor and evaluate and make sure things aren't being appropriated, things that need to be funded, and also how important it is to value ecosystem services. If they are not valued, they won't persist. Then as we moved into the two sessions we've just completed, you know, we heard more about the importance of stories, the importance of creation stories, the importance of storytelling and what I would call citizen science, but I think that was used in many different ways. And more examples we heard also, of course, of commodification. There were at least, well, I don't know, there's probably more than 6. There were many wonderful quotes today, but just a few that I scribbled down are, Western systems are rigid, and therefore nature will always win. Another one, we were admonished that sustainability is not a good enough word to indigenous peoples and local communities. You don't want to just maintain, you want to actually elevate or enhance. A third one was along the same lines as my first one. If we violate natural law, we will lose. A fourth one, I think, came from Monica, where she summarized indigenous values integrate and harmonize with nature. I had not heard about the Abuela sniff test before, but I think that one's going to stick in my mind too, Valerie. And of course, the one-word answer of unity was quite amazing. So maybe I'll just say what I think were some of the advice that you gave us back to the GEF. The theme of integration, which we started with, came back again and again, integrate across peoples, across cultures, across topics, across the multilateral environmental agreements, across geographies, across ways of knowing, that we have to assist in making sure that governance and rights to lands and water are achieved by the Indigenous folks, that we need to invest in youth and equitable spaces. We have to not just think about what more we can do, but also what we can stop doing. And often those come back to the negatives. That we should make conservation of nature exciting. And I think that was a very interesting one, but it comes through with some of the storytelling and the youth as well. Obviously, invest in actionable items. Again, this co-production of knowledge, or what I was calling citizen science, but this respectful side-by-side partnerships in safe places, with the recognition of how important culture and context is. Before the GEF starts something, it should surely understand the landscape of actors within which it's going to act and not duplicate, because we don't need a perfusion, we actually need integration, that we should approach humbly with a sense of place. We should celebrate the successes. We should continue to try to get to what the CEO called policy coherence, or this integration of, if you will, kind of incentives from local to regional to global, that even though we are focused on global environmental benefits, we have to think about co-benefits that are going to be very important to the local cultures. I mean, those include, obviously, things like health and like livelihoods. And so if we're only thinking of environment and not how we can improve those two, that will not be successful. And I think one thing that came through very loud and clear is that you need to have staying power. This is not a one-off. This is not tokenism. This is not, oh, well, we had a good chat. Thank you very much. I think you really need a community and a meeting of minds that continues to share information over many years. So I want to thank all of the speakers today for their wit and wisdom and years of work. I mean, you are all fabulous. You all know so much. You are so amazing. As you said, we will continue to talk about these issues all week. And I hope that the community that we began today, some of us did not know each other before, will persist, will be durable, and that will be part of a longer community for many, many years to come. And I think we all want to achieve the same thing, unity. So thank you very much.